I'm not sure what happens when we click at the same time or admit at the same time, David.
It's fine. It doesn't do anything bad. Okay. So people can watch it throughout. I'll be doing it in the background, but if someone wants to admit, I might be slightly slower. Okay, so we've got a minute to go, I think. We'll give it maybe a minute as well, just for people to join in.
The screen on currently.
Diane, we cannot hear you. She's gone. I think, David, we can start. Hey?
Can we start? Okay, great. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us in our third seminar in a 10-part climate change series. I'm Professor David Bilchitz, Director of the South African Institute for Advanced Constitutional Public Human Rights and International Law, in short SIFAC, a centre in the Faculty Law of the University of Johannesburg. We're delighted to be hosts of the series. The series was created to bring together leading experts who would explore various aspects of climate change from the perspective of multiple disciplines and could help hopefully achieve the goals of avoiding climate change through the, through the carefully designed topics. We delve into science, law, policy, and social justice, and will expose participants to the key debates that occur in these areas. I want to pay tribute to the multidisciplinary organizing team for their vision and leadership. In brief, they are Professor Kitty Dumont, Dr. Jenny Hall, Professor Diane Hildebrandt, Professor Lwazi Ngubevana, and Professor Colleen Fogel. I also want to thank our partner Constitution Hill for their support and advertisements of the series, and from the SIFAC side, Naomi Ho for her administrative work and Ibrahim Karim for designing our posters. Tonight we have only, or today, sorry, we have, it depends where you are in the world, we have only 100 places on the Zoom conversation, but we are also live streaming on Facebook, and we welcome our Facebook viewers. We are delighted to have with us today to deliver the keynote address, Professor Matthew Hornsey, Professor of Social Psychology at the University of Queensland Business School. Thank you so much, Professor Hornsey, for joining us from Australia. Our next seminar will be delivered by Professor Christina Voigt from the Department of Public and International Law at the University of Oslo, and it will be on the topic of whether law can change the climate change trajectory. And I'll put in the link for you to register in the chat, or for those Facebook listeners, it's naomi@sifac.org.za, the same link you would have seen for the advertisement. I will now hand over to the chair for the seminar, Professor Kitty Dumont. Professor Dumont holds currently a professorship in the Department of Psychology at UNISA. She is a qualified psychologist and gained her academic qualifications at the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena in Germany. She works in the field of social psychology, and one of her research areas is intergroup behavior in global risk contexts such as climate change within the societal context of South Africa in particular. Over to you, Kitty, to chair the seminar.
Thank you, David. I would also like to welcome everybody on Zoom or on Facebook to our third lecture of the Climate Change Leadership Series. Today, we will try to provide some answers to one of the most important questions, namely, why do we as people not act with required urgency and efficiency to global risks such as climate change? Since the mid-1960s, for over half a century now, scientists, activists, and since the 1970s, particularly Green Party politicians, call for actions to prevent the devastating implications of climate change. It seems, however, that their calls have been widely ignored as greenhouse gas emissions and global temperatures are keep climbing. To understand why and when people fail to respond to global risks such as climate change with meaningful actions, social and environmental psychologists all over the world have been studying psychological and social factors that influence people's willingness to accept the reality of human-induced climate change and to act accordingly. Professor Matthew Hornsey, our guest speaker today, is one of those social psychologists who, however, not only conducted original studies on those psychological and social factors, but also what we call meta-analytically researched existing studies globally, which helps us to shift our perspectives from seeing many details like the trees to eventually seeing the bigger picture like the forest. In today's lecture, which will draw on multinational data sets, including data from South Africa, and we know this data is scarce, Professor Hornsey will provide some answers on why and what kind of people are skeptical about climate change, and most importantly, why people who are even accepting the reality of climate change nevertheless are unwilling to make urgently needed investments and sacrifices. Before I hand over to Professor Matthew Hornsey, please let me briefly introduce him to you. As mentioned by David already, he is a professor of social psychology at the University of Queensland Business School in Australia. He has published over 150 papers, most of which examine the psychology of influence and behavior change. And his most recent work focuses on understanding people's motivation to reject scientific consensus, like the psychology of climate skeptics, and people's motivations to accept conspiracy theories. Professor Hornsey, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you. We are looking forward to your talk and hopefully an engaging discussion afterwards. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Kitty. I'm going to presume that you can see my slides at this point.
Yes.
It's great to see people come on Zoom. It's a shame I can't to be there and see people face to face, but I appreciate people tuning in both on Zoom and on Facebook. And thanks to Kitty for inviting me to come and join this community. It sounds like a great seminar series. Kitty's already given a heads up about the questions that I'm going to be trying to address today. One of them is this exasperating question about climate skeptics. And after all this messaging around climate change, why is it that some people seem to have their hands over their ears when it comes to the science? And so I'll be talking a little bit about who are these people, what drives them, what can be done to fold them in to the conversation around climate change and to make them part of the solution. And then in the second half of the talk, I'm going to be talking about the rest of us, so the people who are on board with the science, but maybe aren't acting with the kind of urgency that's required to actually avert this disaster. And I should apologize in advance that a lot of the data that I'll be talking about is collected from Australia and America and the UK. And so that's an unfortunate bias that's out there in the climate change literature. I hope that you'll point out to me in the comments afterwards where some of these insights don't really apply to your world. But as Kitty said, I have a small amount of data from South Africa that I'll be talking about as well. Kitty mentioned that this conversation has been going for a long time. This is a quote from a message that the US president gave to Congress in 1965. And you can see that already there was enough science bubbling away that people were concerned about the emission of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and what that would mean in terms of changing the atmosphere. And so back then, discussion around climate change was pretty much a theory. It was a theoretical proposition. Temperatures hadn't increased, but of course we know that since then the temperatures have been increasing quite rapidly. This is one way of graphically illustrating that. So these are the average global temperatures over the last 170 years. The further the string spools out from the center, the hotter the year was. You can see about now it starts to spool out very, very quickly. And really that escalation of temperatures has accelerated over the last few years. This is another way of illustrating the same data. So this is average global temperatures since 1880. Anything that's in red there is an above average temperature. So we're seeing this solid wall of red over the last 40 years. What's interesting, and I think you can see my mouse, I'm not sure, but if you look at the cursor, this gray line is the carbon dioxide concentration in a particular year. And so 97% of climate scientists are saying the gray line is causing the red bars. It's the carbon dioxide concentration that's causing the high temperatures. So 97% of climate scientists are pretty much on board with that message. And yet there are significant and powerful voices that dispute that reality. So famously, Fox News, for example, has run a long campaign of what I would consider to be misinformation around the reality of climate change. Fox is, of course, run by Rupert Murdoch, an Australian, who also controls 70% of the print media in Australia. We have a similar issue with the mainstream media running campaigns of misinformation around climate change. It's not just the media, of course. Some of the most high-profile and powerful people in the world have joined the climate skeptic movement. This was a tweet from Donald Trump 10 years ago now, really, 2012. With an unusual conspiracy theory about where the climate science came from. It's not a particularly common conspiracy theory, but it's interesting how much it mirrors the language around the COVID crisis that we're seeing right now. A more common conspiracy theory is something like this. This is Rick Santorum. He was the third most powerful Republican in the US Senate for a long time. And effectively, it's like people are cooking up the science. And it's an excuse to control you. It's governments and people with green Marxist agendas trying to control your life, trying to control businesses, etc. Obviously, if you've got mainstream media running a skeptic line, and you've got politicians reinforcing that line, then that's going to trickle down to the public. And in some countries more than others, it really has. Now, Australia is one of those countries where there's quite a high level of climate skepticism by international standards. This is quite a recent representative poll. I guess the good news is that a small majority of people accept that the climate change is happening and it's partly caused by humans. But that means that there's 42% of people who don't. In this case, there's 10% of people who say the jury's out. I don't know what to think about climate change. The science isn't in. And then there's 32% of people who are saying the science is in. I know what the answer to this question is. It's just normal fluctuation. It's not something that humans are causing. We don't have to do anything about it. It's interesting, people's instincts when they come across people like that who hold attitudes that are outside the scientific consensus, because the overwhelming instinct, and I know I have it, the overwhelming instinct is to keep repeating the evidence. So you state the evidence, and if that doesn't work, then you repeat it again, but maybe more slowly, or you repeat it again, but more simply, or you repeat it again, but more loudly. Whatever it is, scientists are used to receiving information this way. They are impressed and influenced by evidence coming from experts in a top-down way. And so we sort of imagine that that's how other people will be influenced as well. And to a degree they are. Okay, so 58% of people are on board with the climate science. They can't test it for themselves. They can't touch it or taste it, but they just accept on faith what the scientists are telling them. And so from this perspective, this is what we call the deficit model of science communication. It's basically saying the solution to the problem is more communication, more evidence, more data. And we have to communicate it more broadly and more simply and in a more sophisticated way, and then we're gonna stop the climate skeptic problem. The problem is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence that it's particularly effective with climate skeptics, or in fact, a whole bunch of people who hold views outside the scientific consensus. There's not much evidence that you can have some kind of magical conversion by just busting myths with data or with evidence or with science. We don't see that with creationists. We don't see that with anti-vaxxers. We don't see that with climate skeptics. Sometimes you get small positive effects. Sometimes you get no effect. Sometimes you get little backfire effects. So whatever is happening here, the solution doesn't seem to be just more evidence, more information. And the reason for that is that people don't really weigh up information like scientists do. You know, where you're supposed to carefully weigh up evidence in an even-handed way, and then you reach a conclusion. The argument is that many people behave more like cognitive lawyers. So they have an outcome in mind. They have an outcome that they want to reach, a preferred conclusion. And then just like lawyers, they're going to selectively attend to the evidence. They're going to selectively critique the evidence. They're going to selectively remember the evidence in ways that reinforce that outcome that they want to reach. Right? So this is the principle of motivated reasoning. That quote on the left is from Simon and Garfunkel, right? It said, all lies are just, still a person hears what they want to hear and disregards the rest. That is the principle of motivated reasoning. And so from that perspective, the critical question is not so much why would people reject the science? The critical question becomes, why would people want to reject the science? What is their motivation to reject climate science, for example? And that's a question that my colleague, Kelly Fielding, and I were grappling with when we came up with this model. It's just a simple tree metaphor. And in this metaphor, everything above the ground is what comes out of people's mouths. These are what we call the surface attitudes. So that might be people's expressed climate skepticism. And it's very natural for people to get fixated on that. Of course, people get fixated on what comes out of people's mouths. But according to the model, the key is to screen that out a little bit and to focus on what lies underneath the surface. So what we've got underneath the surface here are what we're calling attitude roots. So these are the motivations for the surface attitudes. It's the identity issues, the fears, the vested interests, the worldviews that motivate the surface attitudes that answer the question, why would people want to reject the science? And so it's these things that give the surface attitude strength. And it's the attitude roots that allow the surface attitudes to survive even in the face of contradictory evidence. And so we've got 6 attitude roots there. I can't talk about all of them. In fact, I'm only going to talk about one of them. If people are interested in the others, they can raise questions after my talk. But the one I want to focus on is ideologies, because this is the one that probably is most implicated in the climate change issue. And there's one ideology in particular that is implicated in climate skepticism. Some people have a worldview that is anti-big government. So they're very much advocates of small government. And they don't really feel as though government has the right to control individual freedoms, to control individual lives, or to regulate businesses and industry. So this is pro-big business, anti-big government ideology. Many people have this around the world. It's particularly common amongst conservatives. If you do have that worldview, then climate change science is sort of a nightmare, because in many ways it does imply a big government response designed to curb the freedom of industry. It does imply more regulation of individual freedoms and the freedom of markets. And so for people who have a free market ideology, that's a really toxic solution. And so, maybe it's better to reject the science than to come on board with a solution that you find very objectionable. Kitty mentioned that I've done meta-analyses looking at belief in climate change. So this is effectively where we just got hundreds of studies around the world looking at belief in climate change, and we just crunched all the numbers together into one big mega analysis. And one of the things we're interested in is what predicts people's belief in climate change. The only statistics I'm going to be showing in this seminar are correlations, really. And if you don't know correlations, it's really easy. Basically, the bigger the number, the further to the right we go, the stronger the relationship. What was really interesting in the meta-analysis was what really popped out in terms of predicting belief in climate change was ideological variables. So individualism here. Where do you stand on the rights of the individual versus the rights of the collective or the rights of society? if you're strongly individualistic and all about individual freedoms, people are less on board with the climate science. The negative number means that they've got lower belief in climate change or they're more skeptical. Hierarchialism just means, do you think that hierarchies are normal and natural parts of life, or do you have a more egalitarian approach? People who are more hierarchical are less on board with the climate science. People who have a free market ideology are less on board with the climate science. And it's interesting because when you measure these things, the measures have nothing to do with climate. The measures have nothing to do with science. The measures are really abstract ideological issues, but they outpredict things that actually you expect to be really quite proximal to people's climate beliefs. For example, have you personally experienced droughts and floods, etc.? People who have are more on board with the climate science, but the effect is tiny. People who know about science, they're literate about science, are more on board with the climate science, as you'd expect. But again, the effects are kind of small. And education, most people's first instinct when they are trying to understand climate skeptics is to say, oh, they're just not very educated, or they don't get science, or they're not that curious about it. And the data suggests that that's not strictly true, that these are very weak relationships. Okay, whatever's going on, it's not about education. Now, I mentioned before that these constellation of ideological variables are things you're more likely to find among conservatives. And you see that in the demographic data as well. This is now polls taken in many countries around the world, and we're looking at the demographic factors that predict belief in climate change. And basically one thing blows everything else out in the water, and that's political affiliation. People who vote conservative are more climate skeptical. There's a bit of an age effect. Younger people are more on board with the science. We mentioned education before, but really the normal fault lines in society don't matter so much. It's about the political ideology that seems to be doing most of the work. If I'm right about this, and part of the problem is people being motivated to reject the science, then the question is, what can we do about that? You know, the argument is if you're motivated to reject the science, you can't just repeat the evidence because you're sort of missing the point. It's a pointless charade. Some people talk about like shadow boxing. You're just throwing evidence at each other, but that's not really the point. You've got to try and work out what the underlying motivation for them to reject the science is. In trying to work out how to do that, Kelly and I used a jujitsu metaphor, another metaphor. Jiu-jitsu is a martial art that teaches people not to take on people's force directly, but to sort of use their force against them. So a lightweight person can defeat a more heavyweight opponent through leverage, through momentum, through gravity. And so we're using this as a metaphor for persuasion in some ways. Basically saying, don't try and combat people's underlying worldviews. What you need to do is detect what the underlying worldview is and then work with it. So you come up with climate change messages and arguments that align with or are congenial with people's underlying worldviews. Now, if one of the primary factors that stop conservatives embracing climate science is their conservative worldviews, then the jiu-jitsu argument would be that you need to come up with climate frames that align with the language and the ideologies of conservatives. That's pretty rare because typically when we're talking about climate change, we focus on themes of environmental protection, we talk about harm, and we talk about justice. And these are themes that traditionally are the moral foundations of people on the left. These are sort of liberal moral foundations. But there's a bunch of research, including some of my own, that suggests that if you use more conservative moral foundations around security, around patriotism, around the need to have economic and technological innovation, the notion of climate mitigation as an expression of personal responsibility. If you use that type of language, it's more successful than just repeating information in terms of capturing conservatives' attention and in terms of switching them on to the climate change cause. I mentioned that a lot of the data in the meta-analysis are very Western. A lot of it comes from America. It's dominated by industrialized Western countries. So of course that raises the question, is this just an only in America? Are we just talking about the psychology of Americans, or is this a global phenomenon? I ran a study to try and examine that question. I was just doing surveys, measuring various conservative ideologies and also climate skepticism, and did that across 25 nations. One of those nations was South Africa. We're just talking 200 people in each. But overall, we've got a reasonable pattern. I know that's a complex graph, but basically the further to the right these bars are, the stronger the relationship is, or the correlation is between being right-wing and being climate skeptical. So right down the bottom here, we have the USA. That's by far and away the biggest one. So it is something that you see more in America than elsewhere. Australia was the second biggest relationship here. You can see that in most countries, it's not a strong relationship. So there's nothing inherent to conservatism that makes people like this. I don't know if you've got your eye in with this graph yet, but in South Africa, we've got a small positive correlation, not anything that's particularly reliable there. That's just my 200 people. It's not a particularly representative sample. If you're wondering why would America have such a strong relationship? Why would Australia have such a strong relationship? I was able to do analysis to look at what explained the variance in that relationship. And it turned out that it was the countries with high per capita carbon emissions where we see that strong relationship between climate skepticism and conservatism. And I think that that's because per capita carbon emission is sort of a proxy for vested interests. It tells you how fossil fuel reliant a country is. America is very fossil fuel reliant, Australia is as well. And in those countries which are very fossil fuel reliant, I do think that you see the situation where vested interests fund campaigns of misinformation, which coach conservatives what to think about the climate science. I can't prove that, but I think there's circumstantial evidence for it. All right, that's the first question. We're all talking about skepticism. The second question is not about the skeptics at all. It's about the believers and could they do more to respond to climate change in their actions. And I just want to put a bit of context around that question as well. So I'm going back to that meta-analysis. And this time I'm not talking about what predicts climate skepticism. I'm talking about things that should be downstream consequences of climate skepticism. Pro-environmental intentions and behaviors. Up the top here, we have private pro-environmental behaviors. So this is how people operate in their private life. Do they try and reduce their carbon footprint using public transport, minimizing the use of electricity, or whatever it is? What we call here public pro-environmental behaviors is sort of more activism related things. Do they donate money to environmental groups? Do they march? Do they sign petitions? Do they talk in public about these things? There's a bunch of interesting things about this meta-analysis. One thing that didn't surprise me, of course, is that people who believe in climate change are more likely to do these things. That's a statement of the obvious. One thing that struck me was that the relationship between believing in climate change and being pro-environmental was much stronger for intentions down here than for behaviors. So in other words, believing in climate change is a strong predictor of whether you intend to be green and a weaker predictor of whether people actually are green. The other thing that actually really shocked me was how small these correlations are. I don't know if you have a frame of reference for how big a correlation should be, but I would have thought it'd be bigger than that. It pretty much says that believers are more green in their actual behaviors than skeptics, but not that much more green. It's not a huge difference. And so I guess that switches me on to the question of why. If people believe in the climate change, they know this is happening, why wouldn't they be behaving in a more green way? So I'm going to float 4 possibilities. One of them is they just don't care, right? So they get the science, they just don't care that much. I don't really think that that's a very plausible explanation. There's a whole bunch of data that show that people think they care at least. This is one. This is a Gallup poll, American data again, but this is asking people, which of these statements do you most agree with? That we should protect the environment, even at the risk of curbing economic growth, right? That's the light green bar. Or should we protect economic growth, even if the environment suffers? That's the dark green bar. And the message here is that overwhelmingly, and it has been since the mid-80s, people say that they'd rather protect the environment than protect the economy. Suggests that people care. This is data from all around the world now. This is over 100,000 people. Asked, would you pay more for eco-friendly products? Would you be a green consumer and would you pay for that? And you can see that the majority of people say at least that they'll pay more to be green. With the older people, that's less obvious, but for younger people, it's quite a striking effect. Here's another data set, same story. There's the percentage of people who say they want to buy brands that advocate sustainability. So in people's minds, at least, they definitely care. And they like to think of themselves as people who care. One thing that's good to keep in mind is that there's a huge discrepancy between people who say that they're going to do these things and people who actually do it. This is green consumerism data. So what we're seeing here is a bit of people talk the talk a bit more than they walk the walk. And again, I don't think it's because people don't care in their hearts or in their heads. I think it's something else. One argument that's out there is because basically people are habitual, that people's lives are a blur and we operate in this autopilot fashion according to habit. So this is a description of how most people shop, for example. It sort of describes me as well. I just go through the aisles as quickly as possible. I'm probably distracted. I'm probably thinking about something else. I'm picking up the same products I've always picked up. Maybe I'll impulsively pick up some chocolate at the counter, but this is a mixture of habit and impulse. There's not a lot of deliberation or reflection going on. So if you ask me in a survey, would I pay more to buy green products? And of course I'd say yes, but then I get to the shop and I don't even really know what that looks like. So there's whole theories around this, that people's behaviors are embedded in complex social practices that we enact in a fairly automatic way. And that's why people aren't necessarily behaving in a green way. Another possible reason the believers aren't all that green could be to do with moral licensing. This is a really interesting concept, that when you do something good in one domain, sorry about that. My lights turn off automatically as a green initiative if it doesn't sense any motion, and it obviously didn't know I was here, so it turned the lights out. Anyway, so I'm back. Moral licensing, you do something good in one domain, and you feel virtuous, and you feel then entitled or licensed to be a bit naughty in another domain. And there's a fair bit of evidence that this is a thing. So people will do something virtuous, like they'll recycle, or they will catch public transport, and then they sort of feel then entitled to be a bit indulgent on other dimensions. Even worse, it is possible that because if people have a green identity and they talk in a way that's consistent with green values and they engage in collectivism and they do the right thing on social media, that they mistake that for being a sort of behavior. And so they feel licensed even though they haven't actually enacted their green behaviors out in the world. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is this one. I'm going to spend about 5 minutes on this one because I find it really interesting. This is a very common argument that what's happening, it's not that people are complacent or that they don't care. It's almost the opposite, that people care too much. Yeah. And so they get overwhelmed with all the doom and gloom. And one response to that is to tune out or to get a sense of helplessness. It's like, it doesn't matter what I do, nothing's going to change. The world's going to hell in a handbasket. It is true that a lot of media coverage around climate change is quite negative because it's a scary and negative issue. The other thing I think is that instinctively people have operated from the assumption that there's too much complacency out there, and so we need to increase the urgency. We need to actually raise levels of concern. And so you see a lot of headlines like this, and there's a lot of very high profile documentaries, etc., that have pretty much worked from that playbook to try and create a sense of fear, to try and create a sense of urgency. Now, in the last few years, I mean, a lot of these documentaries I think have been quite effective and celebrated, but there's been a pushback against this type of approach. The argument that people can't take it anymore, that there's too much negativity, there's too much doom and gloom. People are fatigued. So we use that language of apocalypse fatigue. People just can't take endless negative news. So this is quite an influential article in the New York Times in 2014, talking about scare tactics and problematizing the notion of global warming scare tactics. The illustration is interesting because it suggests exactly what the literature is suggesting, that people at some point just put their hands over their ears, they can't take it anymore. And then over the last few years, this notion has spilled out of academia and really become embraced by a big movement. It's called the Earth Optimism movement more broadly, that we should stop having all the negative talk. We should have more positive talk. We should celebrate success and we should celebrate the wins. And that will activate people or make them feel as though they can do something. And it sort of makes a degree of common sense as well. This is something I found in a review article very recently that was published reviewing the literature, and they said this. They said the overwhelming consensus, not just in academia, but in the public media, is to avoid negative emotional framing of climate change information. Which, again, I'm open-minded to this notion. But one thing that disturbed me a little bit is how weak the data were. There's actually very little data that suggests that this is a problem, that there's too much negativity. There is data in other domains, in the health domain, et cetera, that angle at this, but in the climate change space, it's hard to find data on this. And so that people are operating a lot from instinct. My colleague, Kelly Fielding, her instinct is exactly with this. She said, I completely agree with this. I can't take it anymore. I want more optimism. I think that will work. And I was a bit more skeptical of that. My gut feeling is that maybe people aren't afraid enough, to be honest. But anyway, it's an empirical question. We ran a study to look at this, and 2012 gave us an opportunity to do that, because 2012 was an unusual year in the sense that it was the first year in 30 years up to that point where there was a slowdown in the increase in carbon emissions. It didn't go down, it's just that it went up more slowly. And so that was rare, and so that's potentially something to celebrate, and so we did. We gave people this optimistic message, saying the reductions that are needed are finally happening. And then other people in this experiment, we gave them the same data, but we gave a more glass half empty approach to it. Because after all, it's not like the emissions have gone down. So again, we gave them the same information, but we just put a more negative spin on it and we're more pessimistic around it. So that's all that happened. We had people in the optimistic condition, people in the pessimistic condition, and then we had a bunch of people who just read about how to measure carbon emissions, right? That's a control condition, a neutral condition. And sorry about this table here, but it's pretty simple data. Basically, it's saying, if you look at the bit I circled there, people who got the optimistic message felt more hope. Well, you'd hope they would, because that's what we're trying to do. And people with the pessimistic message, they tended to feel distress, right? So our manipulations are doing what we intended them to do. But the main thing is, it's not how people feel, it's whether they want to do something about climate change. And that's, to me, the kicker, because in terms of this key measure of, do people feel a motivation to respond to climate change? The highest scores were in the pessimistic condition. The optimistic condition, we got no movement from just a neutral thing that was talking about how to measure climate change. This is my most complex slide. It's pretty much my last slide, but this is the two positions. On the right, we've got this motivational model that the pessimism is draining people of hope, and the lack of hope means that they don't feel as if they can do something, which means they tune out. And optimistic messages are going to increase hope and make people feel as though they have efficacy, they can do something, and then increase mitigation motivations. And we, at least in our study, we didn't find any evidence for that. We actually found evidence for more of a complacency model, which is that the optimistic message reduced people's distress. They reduced people's risk perceptions, which then flowed on to reduce distress. And then they took their foot off the pedal. They didn't feel as though they had to make the same sacrifices that they did when they're feeling more distress. And so that's more of a complacency model. So I guess, I know this is extremely unpopular opinion, by the way. Like, I feel like the Darth Vader of climate change research talking like this. But my data suggests that, you know, one of the dangers of talking about wins all the time and having optimistic solutions, etc., is this complacency problem. So that's my take-home messages here, really, that people are sometimes motivated to reject scientific consensus. It's not that they're stupid, it's not that they're not educated, it's not that they've never seen the data or they don't know the arguments, they're just motivated to reject it. And one of the reasons they're motivated to reject it is because they're wedded to conservative ideologies that, you know, ward them off the solution to climate change, which is more government regulation. The other thing is the believers are more green than skeptics. They're just not that much more green than skeptics. It's actually surprising how small that difference is in terms of what people actually do in the world. And so part of that is because people are habitual and automatic in their behaviors and not necessarily engaging their minds when they're operating through life. And the other thing that I want to say is that there's no evidence in my data, at least, that people are tuning out because they're so upset or because they're so afraid or because they're so demoralized, that if anything, the optimistic messages may be less effective than pessimistic messages in terms of switching people on to making sacrifices, the necessary sacrifices. But, you know, I'm sure you'll have opinions on that. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, and thank you for listening, and I'll just open up to the floor now.
Thank you so much. Let's go straight to the questions, Matthew, if you don't mind. I have first question asked, you mentioned evidence, statistics, etc., often doesn't change attitudes. I have heard some research that narratives are much more effective. Is this borne out of your research?
Yeah, you see that generally in the literature on persuasion. That people aren't all that excited by data and baseline facts and figures. That people's minds grip on to emotionally vivid narratives. I see more evidence of this working in the vaccination space than the climate change space. It sort of works against the vaccination cause in many ways, because there's, you know, the thing with vaccination is that all the baseline data suggests it's safer to take a vaccine than to not, and that all the data says that. And yet there will be occasionally people who will take a vaccine and have terrible outcomes. And that's like a 1 in a million deal. But every time you get one of those, you get the vivid emotional narrative that hits the news and gets circulated endlessly among anti-vax websites, etc. And so the counterpoint is to try and come up with emotionally vivid examples of the negative consequences of not taking vaccines. Now, and the climate change equivalent will be to focus on particular climate disasters. So you see, I mean, I know in South Africa and Cape Town and Johannesburg to a degree as well, right? There was like an enormous problem with the water. And in Australia, we had the bushfires at the beginning of last year. And so when you have these vivid, material, in your face, proximal stories, I think you see a rapid shift in people's attitudes and behaviors. Yeah.
All right. Before I go to the next message, can I ask you perhaps to stop the the presentation, that we have the pictures? Yes. Sorry. Oh, now my chat is gone. Oh. Sorry, guys. David, can you see the chat? I can't see it anymore now for whatever reasons.
Yes, just click perhaps again on the chat question, on the chat box.
Okay, sorry.
You come up again.
Ugh. Do I just have to move it? Can you just take over?
I can ask that question. The next question, Matthew. Thank you very much. This is from Jenny Hall. If I understood correctly, climate believers are more likely to be available to hear evidence. Is there a problem that they are not getting enough information to know how to change their behavior? And perhaps I might add on, is it not easy enough to change behavior as well?
I think the argument, the argument against fear campaigns and raising negative emotions is that in the absence of a concrete pathway forward, unless you give people specific information about how they resolve their anxiety, then people will tune out. The thing is with the climate stuff, I feel as though there's been relentless messaging around this. I find it hard to believe that anyone who's paying any attention at all wouldn't know the little things that they need to do to try and reduce their carbon footprint. So I think for people who are paying attention, obviously, more information is good, but I don't think a lack of information is necessarily the issue for those people who are believers. My gut feeling, I'm curious to think what other people is that people know what to do, but then don't have quite the sense of urgency yet to make sacrifices to do those things. So they'll do things that are fairly convenient and don't imply sacrifice, but trying to get people to take the next step to make sacrifices, I think is going to be the big challenge. And I think that a lot of people who are concerned about climate change find that hard to believe, because they and everyone they know is really concerned about climate change, and they have fear about it and they have anxiety. But that's not, I don't think that that is the case for the vast majority of the population. I think that they're concerned about climate change in a fairly abstract, distal way, like they're concerned about world poverty. But it's not something that's not like a fear in the belly that drives them forward. And it's interesting when you see people with fear in their belly. I mean, this probably is a story that you can relate to in South Africa, but 10 years ago in Brisbane, which is where I'm from, it's a city of about 2 million people. Our dams went down to, I think it went down to about 10%. And so for a couple of years there, we were facing the prospect of running out of water. So I know this has been the issue in Cape Town, etc. That's when people feel actually afraid. There's actual fear in the belly. There's real urgency around that. And one thing that struck me as I was looking around going, this is how people behave when they're afraid. Everyone made sacrifices. People engaged in all sorts of normative influence to police the people around them to make sacrifices. They encouraged the government to regulate it even more and more and more. So there was a strong coordination, both from the public and from governments and from industry, to try and make rapid change. That's what happens when people are afraid. And that's exactly what's not happening in terms of responding to climate change, because I think that the risks all seem too distal and abstract for people right now.
Mm. Next question would be from Diane Hildebrand, and she asks, what sort of methods do we need to use to convince conservatives?
There's two methods that in my research I talk about, and one of them I mentioned, which is to try and use arguments that align with conservative values. And this is it's a confronting and threatening thing for a lot of people in the climate space because conservatives are sort of the enemy or considered to be the enemy. But I think that in terms of pragmatic persuasion, this is fairly standard communication principles that you start with the audience's head and you work backwards. You think about what switches them on and what their language is, and then you use that language to switch them on. And so there are examples of this working in terms of, yes, there are free market friendly ways of addressing climate change. Right? Addressing climate change is important for energy security. Addressing climate change is going to create green jobs and green innovation. So these are examples, combating climate change is going to help protect a way of life, and it's a patriotic act. These are things that conservatives get. And so there's some evidence that it's more effective than the traditional data approach. The other thing is to try, because there are conservatives out there who are trying to fight climate change. And we know that those voices are much more powerful than other types of voices in terms of convincing conservatives. So in some ways, it's up to those minority conservative voices, giving them the space and the voice to be able to wield the impact that only they can wield.
Mm. All right, and Andrea Marie Potriter asked, my research in South Africa has shown that believers often engage in other behaviors like eating less meat, deciding not to have children, working on volunteer space. Could your findings about believers perhaps just mean that we are not measuring the type of behavior they are doing?
We had a fairly, I mean, I only mentioned a couple, but we had quite a large suite of behaviors that we were measuring. And remember that a lot of this stuff, not just in my own research, but in the meta-analysis, this comes from dozens and dozens of studies that all measured a diverse number of things. I think that type of behavior you're talking about, where is something that you see amongst the committed, passionate climate activists, which might make up 95% of our social worlds, but make up a very small proportion of the actual population. And so, it's interesting with vegetarianism, for example, because I look around and I think is like everyone I know is vegetarian. Right? And I imagine, that the majority of people are vegetarian, but the data show it's like 5% of people are vegetarian. So it's very difficult to get a grip on what the broader public thinks, because of course we're all in bubbles. But yes, that 5% of people they're the ones whose hearts are breaking, and they do have fear in their belly, and they're feeling actual distress and depression and clinical issues around climate change. Now, for those people, I think they need the optimistic messages. They need the wins to help alleviate their mental health symptoms as much as anything. And so they're the ones who are pushing for more positivity. And I get that, and I think that's good for activists. But I think for the rest of the population, it's not that they're too upset about it. I think they're not upset enough, is my feeling.
I don't know whether, I don't even know the English word. I know just in German, climate Angst, the fear of climate change, I mean, whether it's actually already a clinical diagnosis, I guess you will find it particularly among young people.
Well, it's going to be seen when this generation, who are currently at school, because I'm noticing a fair bit of that amongst high school students. And when that generation comes through, we could be seeing a different approach, but we'll see.
Then Lara Vallis says, on the hypothesis about automatic behavior and being time poor, I have read interesting narratives in the field of studies of the impact of mindfulness on propensity to act in a compassionate way. One interesting study found a direct relationship between being in a rush and being less likely to act compassionately as one might imagine. So this was a comment, and then she asked, considering the majority of the world's working population are time poor, have any studies been done on the effect of messaging that still highlights urgency to act, but emphasizes how little time these actions need to take and how manageable they can be?
It's such a great question. First of all, I'm aware of this research on being in a rush. Being in a rush does terrible things to people. I mean, people are much less compassionate, much less likely to help generally when they're in a rush, which is a confronting notion, given them in a rush all the time. I think that I would love to see studies that don't just talk about urgency, but also talk about how easy it is. I can't point to any right now, but I think some people would argue that psychologists have got the wrong end of the stick. And I sort of understand this. They're saying there's all this focus on individual responsibility and individuals changing their behaviors. But what we need to do is change social practices and create environments that make it easy for people to do the right thing. And I agree with that too. I still think that individuals have responsibility. But I think it's the responsibility of the system. And that's where we get businesses, industry, and government to cooperate, to make it more of a flow state for people to behave in an environmental way. I know that in Australia, just about everyone recycles. It's not because we're all green, it's just because it's the easiest thing in the world to recycle. It's been made very easy for us. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting question.
And then, I guess I have problems to pronounce the name, Ancestor Willis. And he says, or she, could the lack of behavior change, even for believers, also be attributed to living in a system which is simply not supportive of green behavior? For example, a lack of access to public transport, local roads not being safe for walking or cycling, not being able to afford install solar panels, and so dependent on the fossil fuel grid. I guess it's the majority.
Yes, I completely agree with you. I feel as though you know, when I first saw the behavior data, I was thinking, well, you know, like, not everyone can catch public transport. That's just unfeasible for some people, depending on where you live. And there's a whole lot of versions of that. You mentioned the solar panels thing. That's going to be unfeasible for many people in many countries. And it's not about whether they're green in their hearts. It's just a ridiculous notion. And, you know, the thing that bothers me a little bit, though, is I didn't mention it, but I put it on the slide, is that there was quite a weak correlation also between believing in climate change and supporting a carbon tax or supporting cap and trade. So these are things that, you know, there's no pragmatic obstacles to you supporting those things. It just means that you need to make a bit of a sacrifice for those types of policies. And so I still think that my conclusions stand on that. But I think that there is a broader global argument around this as well, of course, that the notion of degrowth, slowing economies down, rapidly decarbonizing, that the notion of living with less and scaling our lives back, that this is something that's a luxury or a privilege of privileged countries that are already rich. And so they've got rich destroying the world environmentally. And now they're saying, don't make these sins, you know, as other developing countries are basically trying to boot up their economies and reduce poverty overall. They're saying, no, don't do that, we need to calm everything down. And so there is a proportion of people who are like, you know, pragmatists around this, sort of a hard-nosed pragmatism that doing with less is sort of privileged speech, and that they're focusing on, you know, that you can cut ethical corners in order to keep an economy growing. And so I'm aware of that perspective as well, that global perspective.
Sue George just posted at the Facebook Climate Council news page, posted today that 8 high school students have won a landmark climate case, which asked the court to recognize that Federal Environment Minister Susan Ley has a duty to protect young people around Australia from foreseeable future climate change harms, with this reference to the approval of the Vickery coal mine. So it's interesting to see what's happening.
They won a landmark climate case. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, David, I've been fascinated to hear about the legal aspect of this. I mean, we see this in corporations all the time, that increasingly corporations are now liable and culpable for a lack of sustainability or unethical behaviors, etc., in a way that was unimaginable even 5 years ago. And I think it's creating this rapid change in culture. So people aren't just having to be held to account to the moral and legal standards of today, but potentially of 5 years' time and 10 years' time. And so I think we are witnessing that shift actually in industry and among corporations. It's happened very slowly for many of those corporations. It's happened after years of scrambling the science and running interference. But in some ways, in Australia, I'm seeing more activity towards trying to decarbonize among corporations than the governments really have the stomach for, which I find interesting.
Jenny asks, it will be interesting to see what the impact of yesterday's Dutch judgment is, which ordered Shell to reduce emission by 45%. That is another example of how the law might influence our behaviors or the behaviors of corporates.
But what we see as well is there's like, you know, mimetic theory, which is that basically, you know, corporations and governments copy each other around the world. Once the precedent has been set, there's sort of a domino effect as other governments rush to align. Yeah. And so I saw that Dutch judgment, and I've got my fingers crossed that what we'll see is a concertina, a domino effect of similar judgments. But I have to say, I mean, I think that the big oil and gas companies have been pivoting around this for quite a while. I mean, you can see that they've tried to milk it as long as they can, but they now know that, you know, where the future's heading. The question is it too late? But.
Yeah. So there are no more questions on the chat, but I would like to take my privileged position
Yeah.
to pose the question. And I was just wondering, I mean, you stressed it a couple of times. It's this kind of rather weak link between intention and behavior, and you came up with some explanations for it. Can it also be, that because climate change is really a global issue, and it is portrayed as a global risk, as a global crisis, as also we know that certain regions will be hit harder than others, and mostly those who actually didn't contribute so much to the crisis, that also these kind of even among the believers, when we see that there's actually not this response or the behavioral change, does it have to do that people are looking also for global responses? It's a global issue, and and I mean, we know this, that people kind of then go in denial and say, well, what can I do on my own? Yeah, so I'm helpless. Yeah, so that there actually people look for something more tangible, which is a bigger, like a collective action. Yeah, in terms of to respond to it. And related to this, there is this Israeli guy, Natal Ival. He wrote this book on revolt, the world's wide uprising against globalization, because we also have this going on. And he makes reference to the second half of the 20th century as the age of responsibility, or in social psychology, I know you did research on forgiveness, this kind of the age of apology. Yeah, so and I'm not sure whether we are still there or whether we actually entered a new age. I don't know whether it's the age of blame or kind of where we are heading to. That you have this. It's a global crisis. It kind of requires a global response. Because we compare what is the other doing. And somehow we have this tendency to revolt against globalization.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's a really interesting dynamic about rebelling against globalization. But things like COVID and climate change and these existential threats remind us that sometimes the global cooperation is absolutely necessary. I do think that there is a sense that, well, why should we make sacrifices if other people aren't? I also think that can be used in a very cynical and exploitative way. So Australia probably could not have done. I mean, we've done less than just about anyone in the international stage, really, to try and respond to climate change. And we have one of the highest per capita carbon emissions in the world, and we're exporting carbon to the world. But you do hear conservative politicians say, yes, but until such and such does more, until such and such does more, why should we? And I think, well, they are doing more. They are doing more. But it's a narrative that people who don't want to make sacrifices are willing to hear. So it's motivated reasoning. But what's interesting about the efficacy, you're absolutely right. I'm fascinated by this question of, do people feel as though they can make a difference with climate change? Because on a really quite realistic level, no individual can make much of a difference to climate change. But people's sense of efficacy is actually quite high. If you measure it, it's actually quite high. And in fact, it goes up the more scared you make them. So the more the fear campaigns, the more anxiety, the more it goes up. I call this motivated control. Like in the face of this threat, you want to believe you can do something.
Yes.
If you can't teach people they can do something, I've noted that there's very little evidence that you can teach people to improve their sense of efficacy. The only thing that works is the collective stuff. These narratives, coming back to what David was saying, narratives about collective cooperation actually creating change does inspire people. And so I've seen evidence that does help.
Because I mean, the problem is if we work with tangible fear, then it's too late.
Yeah. Some people will say it's already too late.
Because if you go over a certain, kind of tipping point, then you might not be able to control it.
Well, it was very interesting watching in Australia the conversation changed with the bushfires, because suddenly it's in people's faces. It's right there. It's choking up the atmosphere. It's killing millions of animals and people. And I remember all these people who I know were climate skeptics saying, oh, well, people should have communicated this better. Why weren't the governments doing something about it?
Okay. So
Now,
we are
why
back.
were the scientists telling us about this? And I'm thinking, we've been talking about nothing else for 50 years, but it's just where you choose to locate your gaze.
Yeah. All right. Then we're just here at the end. Sue George, well, I hope the South African government takes note of the Australian judgment. The groundbreaking Dutch judgment is attached. David put the link on the chat. So I think there are no more questions. I have many more, but I can post them to you via email. And Jenny says, fascinating talk. Thank you. I would like to thank you, Matthew, taking the time, sharing with us your research and your insights. David, can I hand over to you?
Thank you very much. And I'm just going to thank you very much, Matthew. I thought that was from someone who's not a specialist in this area. It was so clear and accessible and fascinating and critical for all activists, I think. So you've given us a very important seminar. I hope it will be disseminated widely. And thank you very much for sharing your research. We are really much appreciative of it. And thank everyone, and please, you can show your appreciation, those who've been listening, by chat messages or jazz hands or whatever you wish to do. So,
Okay, thanks, David. Thanks everyone for the good vibes. Yeah.
Yes. Have a good night with you. Bye.
Yeah, enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Join us for the next one in 3 weeks' time, and that will be in the evening again at 5:30. Thank you very much. 17th. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.